there are formulas that work for certain people, but they don't work for other people, you know. So ultimately, it's up to each person to discover their own technique, what works best for them.
This episode is brought to you by Bulletproof Script Coverage, where screenwriters go to get their scripts read by top Hollywood professionals. Learn more at covermyscreenplay.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Alan Ball. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Alan.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
I appreciate you, man. I've been a fan of yours for a long, long time. 6 Feet Under, my wife and I were obsessed. And we caught it after it went off the air, and we just binged the entire show, which is the only way to watch truly that show, is just to sit there and just enjoy it all at once. And and we were True Blood, of course, and American Beauty, and so many things you've done over the years. But my very first question to you, sir, is why and how did you get into this insanity that is the film industry?
Well, I wanted to be a playwright. I majored in theater when I was going to a college, and I started a theater company. I started 2 theater companies, actually. And I was writing plays. I was working for Adweek magazine during the day, living in New York. And then our theater company would put on plays in basements, you know, and off dark nights for theaters. And I wrote a play called Five Women Wearing the Same Dress about bridesmaids at a wedding in Knoxville, Tennessee, and it got produced off Broadway, to be honest. And somebody from Carsey Warner TV, a man named David Tochterman, saw it and suggested that they hire me to write for sitcoms. And I got a job offer to write for the 2nd season of Grace Under Fire. And I figured, well, how many times is this going to happen? And the theater company I was working with in New York was more of a hobby for most of the people in it than it was actually pursuing, you know, what they want to do with their lives. I mean, it started out that way, but then as the years went by, people's day jobs turned into careers. People started having children. And so I thought, well, how many times is this going to happen? And I came out to Los Angeles. I think it was probably around 1996 or 97, and started working in television. And that was where, you know, that was where it all started.
What was the culture shock of going from playwright to a writer's room?
Well, first of all, in the theater, everybody has a certain respect for the text and a certain respect for the writing that just did not exist in at least on the shows that I worked on. Writing was just viewed as disposable. And I remember, you know, we would have a table read on Monday morning, and there would be a joke that would kill, and then we'd have the run through on Tuesday, and it wouldn't kill as much because people had heard it. You know, it wasn't a surprise. And then when the network came on Wednesday for the run through, they'd go, well, that joke doesn't work anymore. And you're like, it does work. It just doesn't work for you because you've heard it. And then we'd have to stay and write a whole new script. And then on show night, when the show was being filmed, you know, the new joke would do okay. And then everybody would huddle and they'd say, let's go back to the table read joke. And they would, and it would kill because the audience had never heard it before. It was also sort of shocking to me. I mean, this was so long ago, but you know, there was a level of political correctness, for lack of a better term, that was prevalent in the theater when I worked in the theater. Whereas when I started working on Grace Under Fire, that writer's room, anything could be said, and things that would get a lot of people in trouble today. I mean, I remember one of the writers, a guy who I love actually, said, you know, at one point he said, if it was raining whores, I'd get hit by a fag. And which is funny.
I mean, to be fair, that is a funny gag, a funny joke. But I could understand how the Twitterverse might not accept that right now.
Well, at the time I was like, wow. I'm not used to people who, talk like that. So, but it took some getting used to. So that was the biggest culture shock. And also, I think, working multiple seasons, you start to just feel like the work is so disposable. It's like, okay, there's Sybil got a bad haircut and it reverberates through. Well, Sybil was the show I worked on after Grace Under Fire. You would spend all this time on this 22 minutes and then it's done, and then you're doing it again, and basically it's just like, figuring out ways for a bunch of people in designer clothing to insult each other. And I sort of felt like this isn't about anything. And it really wasn't. You know what I mean? And it sort of frustrated me a lot, because I felt like my work, which had always been something that I didn't get paid for, but that I was really personally invested in, had become just, like punching a clock and doing factory work. And I started to feel really disgusted with myself. And ultimately that led to me writing American Beauty, because I just had to write something that I cared about and that I felt like had something to say about something, even if just to me.
No, and so that I as you were saying the story, I'm like, this must have been what led up to American Beauty, because it's around that same time that you were writing it. I always like to ask this question because a lot of people think that you just sit down for the first time, like the legendary Stallone Rocky script. Oh, I wrote it in a weekend and I won the Oscar. How many? and he actually has said, he goes, I wrote the first draft in a weekend, but I beat the hell out of that thing for the next handful of months. But so for people listening, to kind of take the delusion away, how many scripts, how many things had you written, either plays or sitcoms or other scripts, had you written before you tackled American Beauty?
Well, I had written a bunch of sitcom scripts, but, I hadn't I wrote a bunch of sitcom first drafts, but the sitcoms I worked on got rewritten by an entire room of people. I had written several one-act plays. I had written a full-length play, the Bridesmaid play, and I had written a screenplay because I wanted to just teach myself if I could do it, if I could write in the medium, and I had written that before I moved out here. So I had, I had been, I guess, that I had written a fair amount of stuff. But in terms of writing American Beauty, that was my second screenplay and my first produced screenplay. And
how did American Beauty come to life? Like, how did that story? Because it's such a brilliant story, and the way the characters work with each other, and and obviously how it was directed and how it was produced was magical as well. But it all starts with the text. How did it even come to life? How did that idea germinate?
Well, when I was living in New York and I was working with my theater company, there was I don't know if you remember this, you maybe were not even born but there was a big trial going on, and this Long Island guy, his name was Joey Buttafuoco.
Oh, I'm older. I'm old enough, sir. I know who Joey Buttafuoco is.
So the whole Joey Buttafuoco, Amy Fisher thing was happening. And I remember they were selling comic books outside the building that I worked. And there were these weird comic books. And on the cover was Amy Fisher looking all virginal, Catholic schoolgirl, and Joey Buttafuoco at the door, leering at her with a big beer belly and wearing a white, white beater, and having a beer and looking at her all monstrously. And then you flip the comic book, and on the other side, there's Joey Buttafuoco standing at the door with his shirt all buttoned up and a tie, and he's going to work, and he looks like a good husband and a good Christian. And Amy Buttafuoco is all tarted up and looks like a slut trying to seduce him.
Right.
And I remember thinking, the truth lies somewhere in between that, and we'll never know. We will never know what happened. And so then when I moved to LA, I was working on TV. Actually, I had written 2 screenplays before I wrote American Beauty. I did a rewrite on this romantic comedy about 2 divorce lawyers who fell in love with each other, who had been married before, but they were divorced now, but they fell back in love with each other. And my agent, I switched agents because my agent left his agency, and it was time for me to kind of get better agents. And I had dinner with him, and he said, I need you to write a new script because everybody's read these 2 scripts and nothing has happened with them. So I need you to write a new script to reintroduce you to the town. And I said, okay, well, I've got these ideas here. 1, this is pretty standard romantic comedy. 2, here's the second pretty standard romantic comedy. And I was pitching these to him. And then I said, and then there's this movie, I don't even know how to characterize it. There's this, this couple in the suburbs and their daughter, and there's a guy next door with a video camera, and I just expected his eyes to sort of glaze over because it was not, I couldn't, it wasn't like a 1-sentence pitch.
It's not a great pitch. It's not a great pitch.
Yeah. And he said, that's the one you should write. And I said, really? Why? And he said, because that's obviously the one that you feel the most passion about. Later, he told me I had no idea that I could sell it. I just thought we'd have a really interesting writing sample. So that's how that came about. And so I worked on it for about, I was doing the sitcom Sybil by then, and there was this big meltdown on the staff, and a bunch of people quit. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to quit, and they said, please stay for 1 more season. And they offered me so much money at the time for me that I thought, well, okay, I'll stay and I'll just bank this money and then I'll write the Great American Screenplay. But I hated the work I was doing on Sybil, and I hated it so much, and I was filled with so much rage, mostly at myself for having accepted, another season on that. And I couldn't wait. I just, I would come home at midnight, 2 a.m, and I would sit down at my computer and I would just pour all my rage into the screenplay.
And so when the script gets sent out to town, and then you've got, if I remember, Spielberg was he a producer on that, or it was DreamWorks, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah. So Spielberg was involved, and I mean, when all of this magic happened of, the filmmakers behind it, and Spielberg, and what were you feeling like? Because at this point you were really just a sitcom writer, essentially. Yeah. So you weren't you weren't any big time screenwriter or anything like that. So what was it like for you going through that process? I'm assuming you met Steven and you sat down and had conversation. Like, this must have been a whirlwind experience for you.
It was crazy. The script went out and it got passed on by most everybody, but then there were a few people who wanted to meet with me, and DreamWorks was one of them. And I went over to DreamWorks and I met with Dan Jinks and Bruce Cohen, who were the producers, and Bob Cooper, who was, I believe, head of production over there. And they were talking about it, and then and how much they loved it, and that they really wanted to do it, and I had gotten a phone call from my agent the day before saying, Steven Spielberg's reading the script, so let's wait until he reads it to decide where we're going to go. And so I met with Dan and Bruce at DreamWorks and Bob, and I was walking back out to my car, and Dan and Bruce were following me, saying, they were really passionate about it and they really wanted to do it. And then I see Steven Spielberg coming out and walking towards us, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm about to meet Steven Spielberg. Just act normal, don't," because I felt like a big geek. And he said, "Oh, hi. He said, I really love you." They introduced me, and he said, "I really loved your script. Why haven't I heard of you?" And I said, "Well, I've been working on sitcoms, you know." And he said, "Well, you should only be writing screenplays, and you should only be writing your own screenplays." And that was an amazing thing to hear from, a filmmaker like him. And then through the whole process seemed just sort of charmed, you know. I met Sam Mendes. I went to see Cabaret on Broadway, which was running at the time that he had directed. And I really liked how he had put his stamp on it, but it was always in service of the story. It wasn't like, here's some directorial flourish that I put in here because it's cool. Everything was always in service of the story and the characters. And then I met with him, and we immediately hit it off, and we immediately, realized we were both sort of on the same page about the movie.
And then, by the way, that was the first movie he directed, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
So he had a first time, quote unquote, first time writer, first time director.
Yep.
With Spielberg and DreamWorks pushing it. This is a unicorn of a story, essentially.
I know. Everybody kept saying to me throughout the entire process, it's not always like this.
Right. It just.
And I have since learned, no, it is not. It is not always like that. But then Sam was, we were talking casting, and Sam was like, I personally see Kevin Spacey and Annette Bening, and I was like, okay, get them. That's great.
Sure, why not? Yeah.
And it went into production relatively quickly, and the whole thing felt sort of charmed.
Well, so let me ask you. So obviously the movie came out and it was a big hit, and it's such an interesting movie because it's a hard sell. It's not an easy trailer. It's not an easy. The poster was like, what? It's like it all was extremely, unique. And so outside of a Hollywood studio, can you imagine a Hollywood studio doing that today? Like that wouldn't even, there's no way a Hollywood studio would release a movie like that in a major way today, in the way that the studios are right now. Right. But so let me ask you then, once it got out and, the Oscar showed up and you're there at the night and did you think that you had a shot in the world to win an Oscar?
Well, I did, because I had won a bunch of other awards.
Through award season. Yeah, through the award season.
I had won the Writers Guild Award. I had won a Golden Globe. So I was like, this might actually happen. I had a flask of whiskey in my tuxedo pocket, which I hid throughout the night because it was so overwhelming.
Sure.
Yeah, it was really weird, especially once the award season thing started and DreamWorks started sending me to Santa Barbara Film Festival, this particular conference where screenwriters are talking. And I just said, yeah, I did everything. And it became very strange. For a while, it became like my job was just being me and being the screenwriter of American Beauty and talking about it at panels and film festivals and on radio stations, and I got interviewed by CBS This Morning, and it was crazy. It was really sort of insane, but fun. It was an experience that I will both treasure and feel like I'm lucky I survived that. Because I think that kind of attention can make you go crazy.
Especially early in your career. Like if you're a young screenwriter, young director, young actor who gets that kind of attention, you worked with Anna Paquin, she was one of the youngest to ever win an Oscar. It can destroy a person. That kind of attention, that kind of love, and you're the best. You start believing that hype, and all of a sudden you just derail.
Well, especially if you're like a neurotic person who was always
Right.
yearning for that without ever getting it. But I was lucky that I was in, I was like 42, 43, 44. So I wasn't, I think if it had happened in my 20s, I would have gone crazy and probably become like a coke addict or something.
Right, exactly. And any success at that young age is so difficult. So you win the Oscar. I always like answering this question from Oscar winners. How did the town treat you? What was that? Because that's now the next whirlwind of the water bottle tour. I'm assuming you're starting to take meetings all around town and what's your next project? And they're throwing like, what do you want? What do you want? Anything. So you got a golden ticket for a short window of time, if I'm not mistaken, correct? Mm-hmm. Almost. So how did it work for you? How did you capitalize on that time in your career?
I noticed that when I went to meetings, people acted like what I was saying was worth listening to. Prior to American Beauty, I would go to these meetings and, talk about, I remember I got a script and I went in there. I had a meeting at Sharon Stone's house with the producer, and they wanted to remake this old movie, and so I watched the movie, and then I came over to meet Sharon, and we I started to pitch my take on the movie, and I said, I think if you're going to update it, I would make this guy a politician, and immediately somebody said, or an art gallery owner. And I was just like, okay, yeah, I guess you could do that.
Or pet shop owner.
Completely changes this pitch that I had prepared. So, and there was a lot of. I remember I went to a meeting and I had written a screenplay of 5 women wearing the same dress, and I went to a meeting, and there was this young woman. She must have just gotten out of college. And she looked like Katharine Hepburn. And I remember she was wearing black velvet pants. And she had requested a meeting with me. And I went into the meeting and she was like, so I read your script. And I suppose I admire what you were trying to do. And I was just sort of like, well, okay, so why did you want to meet me? Why am I here? Because she then proceeded to trash the script and tell me that ensemble comedies didn't work.
Of course.
But then after I won the Oscar, every time I went into a meeting, everybody was sort of sitting there leaning forward, like listening to me. So it validated my thought, if in a way that nothing else could have, I think. So it was very... It gave me a certain amount of freedom in the stuff that I wanted to do. Go ahead.
No. So yeah, it's very interesting with Oscar winners, because sometimes it's like it opens a lot of doors, and other times it's like I had 15 minutes and then I'm back to the grindstone. So it all depends on how you capitalize. But I always tell people I would rather have one than not.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, even years later, it's like, yeah, I won an Oscar, for a screenplay. It's definitely a badge of honor for any screenwriter's career, regardless of how it works out. Now, one thing I've noticed in your filmography, though, is after winning the Oscar for American Beauty, you decided to kind of jump back into television and not continue the road of a prolific screenwriter doing movie after movie after movie. You said, no, I think television is where I want to be. And I want to hear why you decided to do that, because at least from my point of view, it seemed that there's a lot more exciting stuff happening, especially on HBO at that time in the time of when you were starting to come into HBO. They were doing some really amazing stuff. I mean, The Sopranos, obviously, with David and Sex and the City and all these kind of things that they were just breaking molds. So is that what attracted you back to television? Because you weren't doing sitcoms, obviously. You were like, no, I'm going to do something a little different.
Well, I had signed a 3-year development deal a week before I sold the script to American Beauty. So I
Oh,
was committed to this TV development deal, and I created a sitcom for ABC that was called Oh Grow Up, that did not work and did not succeed. And actually, at the end of 1999, there was a People's Best and Worst magazine, People
yeah.
Magazine Best and Worst of 1999, and there was the top 10 movies. And American Beauty was one of them. And literally, you turn one page and it says the worst TV shows. And my TV show, which was called Oh Grow Up, was there. And so at the time I was winning all this acclaim and stuff for American Beauty, I was also trying to salvage this sitcom that eventually got canceled. So it was a great lesson in perspective. But I had, so then I had 2 years left on this development deal, and I didn't want to just like say, "Fuck you guys, I'm gone." I was trying to figure out what to do, and I kept taking these meetings about sitcoms, and it's like we have a deal with this stand-up that we think you're perfect to write a show around them, and we have we have this idea about a man who dies and is reincarnated as a dog, and his wife rescues him from the pound, and she doesn't know he's her husband. I'm like, please just shoot me. And then I had a meeting with Carolyn Strauss from HBO, who was head of original programming at the time. And she said, I've always wanted to do a show about a family-run funeral home. And that, something in my head clicked. And I just went, I spent a lot of time in funeral homes when I was growing up because a lot of people in my family died during a certain time. And so I had a very specific emotional feeling about what that show could be. And I went home for Christmas break, and I wrote the spec on pilot. I mean, I wrote the pilot on spec, because I was dealing with grief because my sitcom had been canceled and all these people had been put out of work. And even though the show was bad, it was a great group of people and I was going to miss them. And I just sort of poured it all into this pilot for 6 Feet Under. Got back to town after the holiday and called my agent and said, call HBO and tell them that pilot, I wrote it. And she sent it over to them. My TV agent, Sue Nagel, sent it over to them, and they read it and they wanted a meeting. And I came in for this meeting and they said, we really like this. It feels a little safe. Is there any way you could just make it a little more fucked up? And I was like, yeah, I'd love to. I've been working in network TV for so many years. I just, I always assumed, that you have to, the notes that I would get in network TV were always could be distilled into two thoughts: make everybody nicer and articulate the subtext, which are, terrible.
Terrible.
Both of them are terrible. And so I did another pass on it and they said, great, we like it. We want to make it. Again, I was having an experience where everybody was saying, it's not always like this.
So, okay. So I've been, ever since I saw 6 Feet Under, if I ever get a chance to talk to Alan, I got to ask him these questions. Obviously, now you kind of explained a little bit that you had a little bit of an inside view of a funeral home run by, I don't know if run by family, but you inside funeral homes, because the depth of what's happening, did you do research? Did you did you hang out at funeral homes? Did you interview family run funeral homes? How did you get the details of stuff, or did you make a lot of it up?
Well, I read a book, a book called The American Way of Death, which is a book that was originally published in the 60s. And it is a sort of screed against what refers to itself as the death care industry. Just sort of saying it's so terrible, and customers are at their most vulnerable, and people are trying to sell them, use that to sell them the most expensive casket because that means that you really loved the person who died.
Right.
it went into a lot of detail about what happens with embalming and in the prep room, and what actually goes on with these bodies so that they can be looked at before, they go in the ground. So I did do a lot of research. We had some consultants that we talked to, but in terms of the story, in terms of the emotional arc of the characters and of the Fisher family, I just made all that up. I mean, of course, it's based on, I come from a very emotionally repressed family where people don't really deal with what's going on. So that kind of found its way in there too. But
it's fascinating that, I had a chance to talk to David Chase on the show, and finding out that The Sopranos was really about him and his mom's relationship was fascinating. And so it seems that a lot of these shows, it's the writer, the creator is pouring part of themselves in there. And that's what makes it sing. Really does. It makes it sing. If you didn't have that,
it personal. Yeah.
But the audience feels the authenticity of it in the writing and then obviously in the performances. And I mean, the whole beginning of each episode with the deaths, it's just so brilliant, man. It's so absolutely brilliant. Obviously you came up with that, and it was just like this gag that it was part of the story for the rest of the series.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that? They're like, this would be a good way to start a show, an episode.
I think it was just, it was very obvious that was the way to open each episode. Obviously obviously it's a story about a family. Yes. But it's also a story about America's relationship with death,
Very much so.
So, and these people who work in these funeral homes are the people that we hire to face death for us. You know what I mean? We don't do things like keep the body at home and, the family washes the body and that kind of, we don't do that kind of stuff anymore. Right. So what was the question?
No, the beginning of the show, the death of each.
Yeah, it ultimately, after the pilot was shot in HBO, we sent it to them on a Friday and they called on Monday and they said, let's go to series. So I was like, okay. And then I was sitting down to write the second episode and I was like, well, how do you start? And it was like, we started with a death, then that's what everyone should do. And then that'll be, the person who goes through and we can build the stories around that. So it turned into the death of the week, kind of the way the hospital shows are the, disease of the week, because it worked and it just, I don't remember struggling a lot to figure that out. I remember it just sort of being obvious that that's what it should be.
Well, let me ask you, what was the biggest struggle with telling these stories of that show, of those characters? Because I mean, it was groundbreaking for David's character, and coming out. I mean, there's so many groundbreaking parts of that show. I mean, it's in the conversation every single time when you're like, oh, the great television revolution, that started arguably with The Sopranos, and then you had the Breaking Bad, 6 Feet Under. It's always in the conversation. What was the toughest part for you as a creator telling those stories and specifically how those characters were kind of brought out into the public the way they were?
I mean, the toughest part for me, I hate to say this, but it wasn't all that tough. I mean, working at HBO at that time, they wanted a specific point of view. They wanted, a voice. I wasn't getting tons of notes to bland everything out and make it palatable for the lowest common denominator, or make it really resemble something that had already been successful. Right. They wanted something that felt new, that was interesting. And because they were working with a different business model than, network television, we didn't have to worry about ratings, and are the advertisers going to be happy? They just wanted a good show. They just wanted a show that would sort of, you couldn't see anywhere else. So the kind of freedom that we were given was great, and I'm not sure it exists that much anymore.
Not much. I mean, yeah, there was a window of a good 10, 15
there was
years
a window,
there.
and then since I've, stuff I've done since I mean, I would get HBO's notes for 6 Feet Under and for True Blood, and it would be like 3 notes,
Tweak
and
this,
all of
tweak
them,
that. Yeah.
yeah, and most of them made sense. And but then later, I did a show, and I would get pages and pages of notes, and it was just like, what I don't, yeah, the industry has changed a lot, and now I find myself at a place where I'm trying to figure out how to fit into it, and how to, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's a struggle with a lot of creators. I mean, the business changes so rapidly. I mean,
Yeah.
a show like 6 Feet Under or True Blood could have never come out in the 90s or the 80s. I mean, it just wouldn't have existed.
Right.
And well, let me ask you this, and please remind me, because I know David's character as a gay character on 6 Feet Under, how many other gay characters were on television prior to his character? I mean, it was pretty, I remember it was pretty like, oh, wow. It's the first time like you're treating a gay character as not a token character, as not as a funny sidekick, as like, oh, this is a real human being with real feelings, and who's a real person.
I mean, I think there had been a bunch there was an auxiliary character on 30 something who was gay, and they showed him in bed with another man, and like everybody's heads exploded, and ABC removed that from reruns or something like that. Now, while we were on the air, Will and Grace came out, because I remember there's a scene where Nate catches David watching gay porn, and David is like mortified, and Nate is like, "Come on, David, I watch Will and Grace. I have gaydar." So I know Will and Grace was on the air. I think Queer as Folk was on the air as well.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember if that was on Showtime or what platform.
Where it was, yeah. But that
I
character
think
was,
in terms of, and both of those shows were like, everybody's gay. This is a show about gay life, whereas David was just a character within a family, and the show wasn't so much about gay life as about this one gay man struggling to come to terms with his own internalized homophobia.
Right. Well, let me ask you this: when you sit down to tell a story, what is your process? Do you outline? I mean, how do you face the blank page, which is always every writer's dread, is that blinking cursor, not the blank, but that blinking cursor. Do you outline a lot? Do you just sit down and just start stream of consciousness? How do you approach a new project?
If I'm writing something for myself, and like a spec pilot or a spec screenplay, I don't outline, because for me to outline, it becomes, well, okay, that's the story. I've told the story. The story is told. So now I'm going to go back to the beginning and just and I like the journey of discovery. Things will percolate, and I'll think about something, and I'll think about the character, and I'll think about what is the opening, and I'll have a lot of that figured out before I sit down to write. But if I'm working on a show, everything is outlined, absolutely, because other people are going to be going off and writing scripts. You can't just say like, okay, everybody just go write what you feel. You have to outline what's going on so that it tracks over the course of the season. And so that's, but on my own, I don't outline.
But you feel.
Let me be honest. I have like a drawer full of scripts that I started that I never finished. because I just
because you
ran out of
didn't.
steam, or I didn't know how to make it go anywhere, or whatever.
And also, I think, for young screenwriters thinking that, like, you see, Alan Ball doesn't outline. I don't need to outline. I'm like, well, there's a difference too. You've been doing this for how many years? So it's like you already, a lot of the things that you would work out in an outline as far as pacing and arc and structure and plots, all that. You have that almost innately in the back of your head and your subconscious when you're writing, or because you've done it so many times. So it's not like because I know a lot of writers who do that. They'll just kind of stream of consciousness and just go and then go back and tweak. Mm-hmm. But because you have this base, you can do that. As a young writer, it would probably be not a smart idea to just start, let's just write and see what happens. But it depends, I guess.
Also, I think everybody has their own technique. I don't believe, and I think part of one's journey as an artist, as a writer, is to discover what that technique is and to be true to it. For some people, outline everything very intricately before they start writing the script, and it works. Some people do stream of consciousness and it works for them. I'm always a little bit leery of any formula for what is storytelling, because I think the minute you do that, you're limiting yourself. Mm. There are formulas that work for certain people, but they don't work for other people, So ultimately it's up to each person to discover their own technique, what works best for them.
Now, Alan, I imagine that, I know, you had a good start with American Beauty, a fantastic start. I'm assuming it wasn't yeses the entire way through your career. I'm assuming you've had a couple of no's along the way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What advice can you give people who are at that place in their career where they're just getting the no? What did you do to just keep moving forward? Even early on, I'm imagining even during the Grace Under Fire and Sybil times, you were getting no's left and right, or being rewritten or being overruled. And that was where that frustration lied. And how did you keep going? Because a lot of people would have just said, you know what, screw this Hollywood crap. I'm just going to go back and be a playwright. I don't need this. I want to go back and be, an important writer with my stories that I want to tell that are important to me. But you decided to keep going and keep going down. So what advice can you give, and what did you do to just keep going?
A lot of people say, like, what should I do? I think you should just, one of the things I learned when I was working as a playwright in New York with our little guerrilla theater companies and everything is we weren't waiting for permission. Mm-hmm. We were putting on a show at midnight on Thursday that maybe 10 people came to see, but we were still putting on a show, and I think I would say, do it yourself, especially now when you can make a movie on your iPhone. If you're getting no, then do something, start something short, do like a 5-minute film, but do it yourself, get your friends to work on it, make it with your iPhone. It's not going to go, it's probably not going to go become like an award-winning short at festivals, but it might. And at the very least, what you have learned from making that is things that you can only learn by making things. And if you're sitting around waiting for permission, waiting for somebody to give you permission, maybe they will, most likely they won't, because, I think most everything that gets submitted gets turned down. I'm dealing with that now. I just my producing partner and I submitted 4 scripts of a TV series that I think I was super proud of, and everybody passed on it. I don't know if it's because it was too expensive, or because we didn't have any stars attached, because it seems like TV has become that. Packaging. You have to have a movie star attached or a TV star attached. But it's frustrating. And if you are organically connected to your work emotionally, which I feel like is important for work to feel really personal and emotional, when it gets passed on, it's going to hurt. But you can't give up. You can't give up.
Now,
just keep going and ultimately figure out ways to do it yourself.
Now, before I move on to True Blood, I have to just say to thank you for arguably one of the greatest last episodes on Six Feet Under. It is a tightrope that is walked by many a show creator
Mhm.
on the ending of a show, and
Yeah,
it is one of the most beautiful endings. So satisfying, so wonderful. Arguably, you couldn't end it any other way. I mean, and we
exactly.
won't ruin it for people who haven't seen it, but it was just so beautifully done, and I just felt so warm inside at the end of that. I'm like, okay, I can let go of these characters now, as
Yeah,
opposed to just cutting to black, David, or or many other shows that just it's hard to nail that ending, to nail the
yeah.
ending of a show. So I wanted to thank you for that, because it's just what it was fun. I was scared too, by the way, as I was going through last season. I'm like, oh God, how are they going to finish this, man? How are they going to finish this? Please don't let me down. Please, I've spent hours and hours and hours on this show. Please don't drop the ball, Alan. Please. So it was
Yeah.
so beautiful that you guys did it so well. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Now, True Blood, another iconic show. How did you get involved with that? Because that wasn't an original. That wasn't an original idea. That was based off a series of books. How did you get involved?
Uh, I had a dental appointment in the Valley and in Encino, and I got there early, like an hour early.
Oh wow!
So there was a Barnes and Noble nearby, and I went and I was just perusing books, and I saw this book, and it was called Dead Until Dark, and the log line on the cover was, maybe having a vampire for a boyfriend wasn't such a good idea. And I thought, oh, that's funny. And I looked at it, it's a little book, and so I bought it, and I started reading it in the waiting room, and it was like crack. And I remember at that point there were four books. She originally wrote, I mean, she eventually wrote 13. Um, but it was all about this world where vampires came out of the closet because of this synthetic blood that they could drink, and it was just I'm from the South. I that whole Southern Gothic thing is in my blood, and I just remember reading it and I couldn't put it down. Um, it was just such a great world and such great characters and so much fun.
Oh yeah.
Um, you know, and I think after 6 Feet Under, I think I just wanted to do something that was really fun. And so I had my agent call the woman who wrote it, and it was under option by a filmmaker, but it was about to run out. And I said, well, I'd like to purchase it. And and I bought the rights, and wrote the script on spec, took it to HBO, and they said, we have a vampire show in development. I said, okay, well, I'll take it somewhere else. And they were like, no, you can't go anywhere else because, you're part of the HBO family. And I said, well,
Put
yeah,
up or
but
shut up.
yeah. And
Put
they
up or
did,
shut up.
they killed that other show. And I feel really, really bad about about the person who was working on that show. But I remember Chris Albrecht was still there, and he called me, and before they said, let's go ahead and do it, he called me and he said, just give me a one sentence thing. What is this show about? And I was like, oh my God, I don't know. What am I going to say? It's about the terrors of intimacy, which is something I just pulled out of my ass. I guess it's kind of true, but and
Sure,
he went,
I can see that.
and he went, okay, all right. And they greenlit it, and we shot the pilot, and then it took and Chris had left at that time, and it was Richard Plepler and Mike Lombardo who were in charge, and it seemed like they were going to pass on it, and it seemed like we were, that it had taken like a couple of months. We hadn't heard back. They were still
Oh wow.
deliberating, And finally, they said yes, and we made the pilot, and we made the series.
And it is, and I mean, the stuff that you did in that show, I mean, you could tell you were having some fun.
Oh my God, it was so much fun.
Oh my God, the characters were so brilliantly written and acted. I mean, it was like a magical, each actor was magically designed for the character that was written on the page. It was so beautiful.
Exactly.
And I mean, let's not even talk about the sex stuff. I mean, that's, I mean, it was, you're just sitting there like, we got to keep the kids out of the room. We got to lock the door when we watch True Blood at night.
Yeah.
They could just walk in on the wrong scene and all of a sudden it was
totally.
It was so much fun to watch that show. Now I know, and I know you directed a little bit on a bunch of your shows. On set, there's always that day that you feel like the entire world's coming crashing down around you. As a filmmaker, we all have those days, regardless of budget, regardless of anything. What was that day for you, either on 6 Feet Under or any of your shows for that matter? What was that day that you felt like, oh man, I'm not sure how we're going to get out of this? What was that thing, if you could talk about it publicly, and how did you overcome that event in the day as a filmmaker?
I remember there was an episode of 6 Feet Under. I think it was the season finale of season 1. And there was Rico and Vanessa are having a party for their they just recently had a second child, and they're having a christening party, and they're doing it at the funeral home. And for some reason, we just got so behind, and it was like, we've been working for 10 hours already, and we have at least 5 hours we have left to do, and we can't push it off to another day because this is the last day that we're shooting. And I remember just feeling like, oh my God, I'm such a failure. I'm such a failure that I allowed things to get this far behind. But we worked overtime, and we got it, and we got everything we needed. We simplified the shot list, but there was a moment where I felt I have no idea what I'm doing, and it's about to come out, and everybody's going to see what a big imposter I am, and
it's fascinating too, because as I've talked to more and more high profile people on the show like yourself who have had some Oscar winners, Emmy winners, things like that, I always find it so fascinating, and I think so educational for people listening that a lot of times they put, people like yourself and other, Oscar winners up on a pedestal, like, oh, they must just wake up in the morning and it's I'll just write an Oscar winning script today, or I'll just write, I'll just write 6 Feet Under, or I'll just whip up True Blood. Like these things I found after speaking to so many people like yourself, that imposter syndrome is a thing, still a thing. So even at the day that you're talking about, you'd already won an Oscar.
Yes.
You might have won an Emmy, or I'm not sure, but you were on the way. You won Golden Globes. You had won a lot of awards already. You're an award-winning writer and filmmaker. And you still at that moment had like, oh my God, security is going to come in and they're going to find out what a fraud I am, and I'm going to be escorted off the set. And that was the feeling that you still had after the success you had. And it's, I think, such a wonderful educational tool for people coming up to understand that throughout your career, it never leaves you.
Oh yeah, no, it never does. It never does. I have such a weird relationship to if I'm finishing a script and I'm doing that last polish of it, I'll read it and I'll be going, this is really good, man. I really love. I think I did something really great here. Close it, file, turn it to PDF, send it off to my agent. The minute I send it off, I'm like, oh, there's a typo. Oh, fuck. And then from there, it just completely unravels. It's like, why is this scene even here? What the fuck are they saying? This is the worst dialogue I've ever read in my entire life. And so,
wow.
I mean, I think, insecurity and fuels a lot of people to express themselves in ways that I think they probably wouldn't do if they were had a little more self-esteem. I think a lot of great work comes from people who are working out their own inner demon.
Neuroses.
Yeah.
Now, if you had a chance to go back in time and talk to your younger self, and you could tell that person one thing, if you were on that when you were making those off Broadway plays, and the Alan Ball of today could go back and just say one thing to that Alan Ball about what the journey is about to be, he's going to go on, what would be that warning or piece of advice?
Well, I at first I thought I'd say don't take the sitcom job, but
No, you had to.
I had to, and I wouldn't. I would just say, like, try to keep your perspective. Ultimately, it's just a movie. It's just a TV show. It's not worth making yourself crazy about. It's not worth destroying relationships over. It's just it's not real life. You know, because I get so invested in my work that it becomes like, you know, when my sitcom for ABC got canceled, I got really depressed. And in retrospect, if that show hadn't been canceled, I would never have done 6 Feet Under. You know what I mean? And I guess I would just say, like, try to take your work seriously, but don't take yourself so seriously, and don't take praise and or criticism that seriously, because ultimately you do the work that you do the best work that you can do, and that's the reward. Whether you get a statue or a nice review, or somebody pans you, or your show gets canceled, that stuff is just weather. You know, it changes. It always changes. And just stay focused on being true to yourself, and also don't compare yourself to other people.
Oh, it's so tough.
You know, don't compare yourself to other writers or other directors, because you just don't.
It's so tough, though. I mean,
you're always going to find somebody that you feel like is better than you and that you feel inferior to, and just don't feed that particular demon.
Before I go to my last few questions, I always ask, I just have to say, in Banshee, because I know you worked on Banshee, the fight sequence in the jail, one of the most brutal things I've ever seen filmed. It is an art piece. And how in God's green earth did you guys do that in the way that you did it? It was so brutal, and not, it was violent and brutal, but it's visceral in the way it was shot. How did you guys get that? I mean, it's amazing.
Well, you know, I was like an exec producer on Banshee. Sure. I was not really that involved in the day-to-day. So that was Jonathan Tropper, writer, and Greg Utanis, director, and Anthony Starr, who is now on The Boys, was just a really genius. I mean, he was so good in that role. I mean, I gave notes on cuts, but usually I would just be like, "Oh, good, I got a Banshee cut," because it would just be fun to watch, because they were doing such amazing work, you know, and I really wasn't that involved, so I can't really take credit for that.
Okay, fair enough. But it was, for anyone watching, you got to watch that sequence. Watch the show, but watch that sequence.
It's a good show.
It was a very, very good show. Now I'm going to ask you a few questions to ask all my guests. What advice would you give a screenwriter wanting to break into the business today?
First and foremost, write about what you care about. Don't write about what you think will sell. Don't write about something that matters to you, because that's going to infuse it with a level of personal passion that hopefully will make it rise to the top of, because everybody's writing scripts that they think will sell. Everybody's writing scripts that resemble something that has already been successful. Mm-hmm. So I would say write what you care about.
I would agree, because American Beauty is not like anything that anybody had written before or since. There's not like an American Beauty type. of script.
Mm-hmm.
So without question. Now, what is the lesson that took you the longest to learn, whether in the film industry or in life?
That failure is part of it. You know, if you insist on seeing things as success or failure, you're gonna get in trouble. Failure is part of it. Sometimes you're never going to get to a place, nor should you want to, I think, where everything you do is good, because to grow as a writer, to grow as an artist, you have to try things. You have to try things, and not everything's going to fly. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you're a shitty writer and you've lost your touch or whatever. It just means that that's part of it. And try not to take it too personally and just keep going, you know?
Yeah, take the big swings is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Without question.
Yeah.
3 screenplays that every screenwriter should read.
3 screenplays that every screenplay. Well, Chinatown.
Yeah.
I would say Nashville.
Oh, so good.
I'm stuck on this third one.
Anything that comes to mind.
Well, one of my favorite movies of all time. Oh, The Apartment.
Oh God, yes, Jack Lemmon. So good. It still holds today. The timing of the jokes, the way they popped it. You know, a lot of movies from the 60s do not hold from today. But The Apartment still holds. And what are I always ask, what 3 are your favorite films of all time?
To Kill a Mockingbird, Nashville and Chinatown, and The Apartment. I mean, those are 3 of my favorite films too.
Well, Alan, I appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with all of us. Hopefully it inspires a few screenwriters and filmmakers out there. And thank you for all the hard work and great stories you've been telling over the course of your career. You're making a difference out there, not only entertaining, but shaping the young minds of people out there.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Alex.
I appreciate you,
It's been such
my
a
friend.
pleasure talking to you. I'm really glad that we did this.